Hello friends. I'm Dr. Pankaj Tikku. I'm a pediatric faculty, and I will be taking these FMG December 2021 recall questions. There were about 21 questions that we could get from the students. These again are all recall questions based upon the memory of our students, and we will I've tried to accumulate these questions, and we'll be discussing upon the answers wherever I could get all the options. I've mentioned all the options, but in those questions where I could get only some of the options, I've mentioned only those options which I could get from the students, leaving the other options as blank. Also, please remember that the answers that I would be giving will be based upon the questions that have been put forward by our students, and we all believe those questions are almost accurate and almost like the questions that were asked in the exams. But in case there were a few lines which were a little different, it could change the answer to the whole question. But based upon the questions that I could get, these are the 21 questions and their answers. So the first question is, which of the following statement is not true about colostrum? So there was a question that was asked in this FMG exam on colostrum, and we in our classes have repeatedly told about colostrums, transitional milk, and breast milk. The choices that they gave was contains IgA, lemon yellow in color, rich in proteins and amino acids, and high amounts of sugar and fat. And the question that they asked was, which of the following statement is not true about colostrum? So now you all know very well that, and I have told this in my classes also, that the milk that comes in the first 4 days of life is the colostrum. So after the child is born, the first 4 days of milk that comes from the breast is known as the colostrum. The milk that comes out from 4 to 14 days from the mother's breast is known as the transitional milk. And the breast milk is actually secreted, the actual breast milk is secreted after day 14 of life. So after day 14, whatever milk the child is sucking is the mature breast milk. Now, all these milk, colostrum, transitional milk, and mature breast milk, the main aim is actually always growth of the baby, and also to prevent any infections and to increase the immunity of the child. The colostrum, which is the milk that is secreted from the breast in the first 4 days after the child's birth, is actually a milk which is very rich in secretory IgA that provides a very high amount of immunity to the child. Also, this is a milk which is high in a lot of vitamins, including vitamin A, D, E, and even in some books it is mentioned that vitamin K is also in good amount in colostrum. Overall, however, breast milk is deficient in vitamin K. But colostrum, they believe, is rich in most of these vitamins, including vitamins A, D, E, and even K. Then the protein content is very high in colostrum. And since the protein content is very high, obviously the amino acid content should be high in colostrum. Now, when the colostrum gives way for the transitional milk, which is secreted from the breast between day 4 to day 14, the transitional milk is different in the sense that transitional milk contains more amount of sugars and more amount of fat in comparison to the colostrum. So how is transitional milk different from colostrum? Transitional milk in comparison to colostrum contains more amount of sugar and fat. It's basically the transition from the colostrum to the mature breast milk. Finally, the mature breast milk, when it is secreted after day 14 of the child's birth, when it is secreted from the breast, the protein content of this mature breast milk is about 1 grams per deciliter. And as you must be knowing very well, this protein content is very high. This protein is very high in casein content in comparison, in whey protein content in comparison to casein. So the whey protein is much more in mother's milk in comparison to casein. Then the fat content also is high in breast milk, making up around 4 grams per deciliter, with most of the fat being polyunsaturated fatty acids. And then the sugar content, mainly the lactose, is about 7 grams per deciliter. So this is actually the content of mature breast milk, and this mature breast milk differs in content slightly from the cow's milk and from the buffalo's milk, and this question also has been asked repeatedly in the exams. So colostrum is the milk secreted in the first 4 days and is very high in secretory IgA, high in vitamins, and is very high in protein content, but is not high in sugar and fat content. So therefore, if they are asking which of the following is not true about colostrum, saying that colostrum is very high in sugar and fat content obviously is a wrong statement. It is high in IgA, it is lemon yellow in color. So colostrum is lemon yellow in color or deep yellow in color. It is rich in proteins and amino acids, and it is also rich in vitamins. But colostrum is not rich in sugars and fats. As I told you, it's the transitional milk which is richer than the colostrum in terms of fat and the sugar content. So question number 1, therefore, according to me, which is not true about colostrum, high amounts of sugar and fat is the wrong statement for colostrum. Coming to question number 2. Now question number 2 says which of these is complications which is noted in an infant of diabetic mothers. Now again, I have talked about in my neonatology classes, including both for NEET PG classes and for FMG classes, I have repeatedly talked about infant of diabetic mother as one of the very important topics for your exams. It is important both for your NEET PG exams as well as for FMG exams. Now, infant of diabetic mothers are prone to develop separate complications, and I have given a mnemonic for those complications. And that mnemonic for the complications is low cost MRP. What is the mnemonic for the complications? Low cost MRP. So the complications of children born to diabetic mothers start with L, C, M, R, and P. These children are large for gestational age babies. These children are known to have many congenital complications or congenital malformations. And common congenital malformations that are seen in babies who are born to diabetic mothers includes congenital heart diseases. Then it includes neural tube defects. Then it includes a very specific complication in infant of diabetic mothers, which is known as sacral agenesis. So sacral agenesis is the most specific complication that is seen in infant of diabetic mothers. M stands for metabolic complications. Now, among the metabolic complications that are seen in infant of diabetic mothers, two important metabolic complications are hypoglycemia in the newborns who are born to diabetic mothers and hypocalcemia in the newborns who are born to diabetic mothers. So children who are born to diabetic mothers are prone to develop both hypocalcemia and are prone to develop hypoglycemia. Now, the main reason why hypoglycemia develops in infant of diabetic mothers is that during the fetal life, when the mother is diabetic, so the high amount of blood glucose is constantly passing from the mother's blood into the fetus blood through the umbilical cord. Now, this high amount of fetal glucose will cause fetal hyperinsulinemia, and this fetal hyperinsulinemia will actually keep the glucose from increasing and will keep it under check. So there is a constant influx of glucose from the mother to the fetus, but because of the fetal hyperinsulinemia, that high amount of blood glucose will not become very high in the case of fetus. So till the time when the child is born, till that time, although the fetal insulin levels are very high, but because there is a constant influx of glucose from the mother into the fetus, that levels of blood glucose remains in check. Now, after the child is delivered, the umbilical cord is clamped and it is cut. So the levels of insulin in the child are still very high, but that influx of the glucose from the mother to the child suddenly gets interrupted. This results in a sudden drop in the blood glucose levels just after birth, leading to hypoglycemia as an important complication. So hypoglycemia is an important complication in infant of diabetic mothers. Children who are born to diabetic mothers, they do not have hyperglycemia. Similarly, hyperinsulinemia is seen in these cases, not hypoinsulinemia. The fourth option I could not get from the students. So hyperglycemia is not seen in infant of diabetic mothers. Hypoinsulinemia is not seen in infant of diabetic mothers. Hypoglycemia is usually seen. And hypoglycemia in newborns is defined as blood sugar which is less than 40 milligrams per deciliter. So because hypoglycemia in newborns may remain asymptomatic and children born to diabetic mothers are at a risk of hypoglycemia, therefore there is merit in routinely screening blood glucose in all children who are born to diabetic mothers. Other complications that can develop in these babies are complications related to R. So R is the respiratory complications that can develop in infant of diabetic mothers. And these respiratory complications includes Hyaline membrane disease and transient tachypnea of the newborn, both of which can develop in infant of diabetic mothers. And P stands for polycythemia and complications secondary to polycythemia that can develop in these babies, including complications such as jaundice and complications such as renal vein thrombosis, all of which can be secondary to polycythemia. So these are the common complications that can be expected in children who are born to diabetic mothers. So children who are born to diabetic mothers are prone to develop hypoglycemia. They do not develop hyperglycemia. Coming to question number 3. Now question number 3 was, which of the following micronutrient deficiencies is associated with the development of Meeks disease? Now this again is something that I have told in my classes repeatedly, in my classes involving FMG students which I recently took, and also in my classes for NEET PG. I've repeatedly told that copper transport deficiency in children is associated with Meeks disease. So Meeks disease is a very dangerous type of a disorder, often fatal. It's a type of an X-linked disorder, probably X-linked recessive disorder. And there is abnormality in the transport of copper. The normal absorption of copper from the intestine is normal, but there is an abnormality in the transport of copper to the tissues. There is abnormality in the transport of copper to the tissues. As a result, what happens is these children start developing systemic copper deficiency. So they not only have reduced serum levels of copper, but they also have reduced ceruloplasmin levels. This disorder is associated with the development of symptoms. So symptoms start from the age of about 2 to 3 months. Symptoms starts from the age of about 2 to 3 months when these children start having seizures. Often these seizures may be very difficult to control with anti-epileptic drugs, and not very infrequently they may become status epilepticus. They also start developing delay in development, so milestones of these children start getting delayed. And a very characteristic feature of Meeks disease, from where this name means kinky hair disease has come, is that the hair shafts of these children is often very flat. So they have a very flat hair shaft, and there are twists that are present at irregular interval in the hairs, which is known as often pili torti. So this pili torti, which is abnormality in the hairs are often very fragile, the hair shafts are often flattened, and there are twists that are present in the hairs at irregular intervals. This characteristically very fragile fuzzy hairs, often referred to as pili torti, is one of the characteristic features of Meeks disease. And this disorder often is fatal, which can lead to deaths of these children by the age of about 4 to 5 years. So often copper deficiency can be associated with other conditions also, such as protein energy malnutrition. So how will you differentiate Meeks disease from those cases of severe protein energy malnutrition? Because copper deficiency can be a feature of proteinergy malnutrition also. So the pili torti will be the differentiating feature. So if there is presence of these typical fragile, rough hairs which have flattened hair shafts, twists in the hairs at irregular intervals, something we call as pili torti, these are the features which are very characteristically go in favor of Menkes disease. So pili torti type of an appearance of hairs or hair shafts along with low serum copper and low serum ceruloplasmin levels will indicate to the presence of Menkes disease. So what is the answer? The answer is Menkes disease. Menkes disease is not any copper deficiency in terms of deficiency in absorption of copper from the intestine. It is rather a deficiency in the transport of copper to the peripheral tissues, which can lead to the development of systemic copper deficiency and its features. So answer to question number 3 is copper transport deficiency. Then there was question number 4, which again is a question that I have repeatedly told in my classes, both FMG classes and in my NEET PG classes, about neural tube defects. The question asked was the dose of folic acid to be administered to reduce the risk of neural tube defects in a pregnant woman with a previous history of birth to a child. So this is a secondary prevention. I've told you that the doses of folic acid that we normally give to prevent neural tube defect, that dose actually depends whether we are trying for a primary prevention of neural tube defect or we are attempting a secondary prevention of neural tube defect. Because if we are going in for a primary prevention of neural tube defect, that means there has been no previous history of neural tube defect. So 0.4 milligrams of folic acid should be the dose daily. But if we are trying to give folic acid for secondary prevention during pregnancy, then the dose needs to be higher, which is almost 4 milligrams of folic acid daily. And this is periconceptional administration of folic acid. It should be started before conception, about 1 month before conception, and should be continued till about 3 months of pregnancy. There have been several reports which have suggested that these doses of folic acid can reduce the risk of neural tube defects in children. So since there is a previous history of neural tube defect in this pregnancy, so this time, this is the second pregnancy. So to reduce the risk of neural tube defect, higher dose of folic acid would be recommended. So the recommended dose of folic acid will be the dose for secondary prevention, which is 4 milligrams of folic acid per day. So for primary prevention, the dose of folic acid is 0.4 milligrams per day. But for secondary prevention, the dose of folic acid that should be given is 4 milligrams of folic acid per day. Coming to question number 5. Now question number 5 says a child presents with a rash in the lower limbs, hematuria, and complaints of abdominal pain and joint pain. The child's platelet counts are normal. So there is no thrombocytopenia, which is an apparent cause for these bleeding episodes which have occurred. So they are asking the most likely diagnosis is. Again, this is something that I've discussed repeatedly in my renal chapter classes. And I've discussed that this is a disorder which is Hinoch-Schönlein purpura. So this is a disorder which is Hinoch-Schönlein purpura. Now this disorder, Hinoch-Schönlein purpura, is a small vessel vasculitis of childhood. So it's a type of a small vessel vasculitis of childhood. In fact, many people believe that this is the most common vasculitis of childhood. Some say it is Kawasaki's disease, but I would say the most common vasculitis of childhood should be taken as Hinoch-Schönlein purpura. It is associated with perivascular deposition of IgA, hence it is also sometimes called as IgA vasculitis. The typical symptoms of this disorder, Hinoch Schondin purpura, is a combination of abdominal pains, joint pains or arthralgias, and typical rashes that appear in the form of palpable purpura and usually are known to appear in the dependent portions of the body. So you can see these palpable purpura which are present in the thighs and in the legs, that is below the waistline, and even in the arms if they are present, usually they are present below the elbows. So these palpable purpura are present usually in the dependent portions of the body. 50% of these children may go on to develop, rather I would say 30 to 50% of these children may go on to develop glomerulonephritis and may have hematuria, as is occurring in our patient also. And usually glomerulonephritis will develop only in 30 to 50% cases of Hinoch Schondin purpura. It is not likely to develop in all patients. If it has to develop, it usually will develop within 3 to 6 months of the onset of symptoms. Within 3 to 6 months of the onset of symptoms. So please remember, if there is no hematuria or no development of glomerulonephritis within 3 to 6 months of the onset of the other symptoms of Hinoch Schondin purpura, then this child is unlikely to develop renal involvement. So the classical 3 features of Hinoch Schondin purpura otherwise are abdominal pain, arthralgias, and rashes. And in our patient also, abdominal pain is present, arthralgias are present, and there is the development of rash in the lower limbs. Rashes are characteristically present in the dependent portions of the body, and they appear in the form of palpable purpuras. Most of these children are known to recover on their own. Prednisolone has been used in some cases for about 2 weeks on an average, only in some cases. But yes, when renal involvement occurs, in those cases, immunosuppressive treatment may be required. So this is very clearly a case of Hinoch Schondin purpura. A child presenting with abdominal pain, presenting with joint pains, presenting with rashes, presenting with glomerular involvement indicates that this child most likely has a Hinoch Schondin purpura. So that answers question number 5. Let us come now to question number 6. Now question number 6 says, which of the following is the first line drug to control febrile seizures? Again, in my questions, in my topics that I have discussed in my classes, I have discussed at length about febrile seizures in the neurology chapter. Febrile seizures are seizures which commonly occur in children between 6 months to 5 years of age. And they are one of the most common, rather I would say they are the most common provoked seizures of childhood. They are the most common provoked seizures of childhood. They usually occur in response to high fever. Although there are some reports that in some children they may get precipitated even with low fever. But otherwise, majority of children, the high fever is the stimulus for the development of febrile seizures. Now, when we are treating a febrile seizure, the treatment principles should be very much similar to the treatment principle of any seizure in childhood. Because ultimately, the first aim is to control the seizure. Then the next aim is to control the fever in subsequent episodes so that you can control any subsequent seizures that can occur in response to that high fever. But right now, if the child presents to you in a seizure, the principles of treatment of a seizure will be very much similar to the treatment of a seizure in any other child. And the drug of choice usually in most cases for the treatment of seizures are benzodiazepines. Diazepam has always remained the standard drug for the treatment of seizures in children, except obviously in neonates when the drug of choice usually is phenobarbital. Lorazepam is a fast-acting drug that has been used at doses of 0.1 milligrams per kg to abort seizures. And the other frontline drug that can be used in case lorazepam is not available is IV midazolam, which can also be given in a zero point 0.1 milligrams per kg loading dose to abort a seizure. Both of these drugs can be given intravenously. In case the child does not respond to this drug, then the next drug that can be tried is IV phenytoin or IV fosphenytoin. IV phenytoin or IV fosphenytoin. In case this also does not work, then the next drug that can be given is IV sodium valproate. In case this also does not work, then the next drug that can be tried is IV levetiracetam. And in case this also does not work, then we might try IV phenobarbital. And then we have other lists of anti-epileptic drugs also which can be tried in case the seizures are difficult to control even with an IV phenobarbital. But the basic thing that I'm trying to convey is that when a child presents to you with a febrile seizure, the primary principle of treatment will be the principle of treatment of a seizure, which will be like any other seizure. So the drug of choice should always be benzodiazepine. But if benzodiazepine is not one of the options, then obviously midazolam is another drug that can be used frontline for the treatment of seizures. So according to me, midazolam should be considered as the first drug here for the treatment of seizures. But yes, if the child does not respond to midazolam, in those cases, then IV phenytoin or fosphenytoin can be used. If a child does not respond to phenytoin or fosphenytoin, in those cases, IV sodium valproate can be used. And in case the child does not respond to sodium valproate, in those cases, IV levetiracetam, followed by, if there is still no response, phenobarbital can be used. But frontline, if someone asks you what is the frontline drug for the control of any seizure in childhood, your answer should be benzodiazepine. And if benzodiazepine is not directly there in the choices, then midazolam. So either they write the word benzodiazepine or midazolam can be the word. Here midazolam was one of the choices. So according to me, before you give phenobarbital, valproate or phenytoin, midazolam should be considered as the first line drug. Coming to question number 7. Now question number 7 says a child with a history of staring episodes lasting for about 20 minutes and abrupt termination. Now this is a typical example of an absent seizure. Again, I have given several examples of absent seizures in my classes. Staring episodes or a sudden abrupt discontinuation or cessation of the normal activities of the child suddenly becomes very blank. Or there can be daydreaming episodes in which the child momentarily stops doing anything. In the past, these seizures were called as petit mal epilepsies, but now this term is no longer used. So the term that we normally use now is absent seizures. Absent seizures are very common in children between 5 to 8 years of age, and typically absent seizures are associated with sudden cessation of the activities of the child, which can be associated with blank staring episodes. A sudden cessation of the activities of the child, which can be associated with blank staring episodes. And then the child starts, as soon as the seizure is aborted or seizure finishes off, then the child suddenly resumes his normal activities without any post-ictal confusion. So no post-ictal confusion is usually present in these cases. Often hyperventilation can precipitate these seizures, and the drug of choice has always been ethosuximide. But if ethosuximide is not available, and there are availability issues of ethosuximide in India, in those cases valproate can be considered as the drug of choice. Most of the absent seizures are very well controlled on valproate. In fact, valproate is now considered as the frontline drug for the treatment of absent seizures. And it's very, very easily controlled absent seizures on valproate, unless and until it becomes atypical absent seizures. which usually have certain other components such as myoclonic components, head drops associated with them. So those type of atypical absence seizures may be difficult to control with these anti-epileptic drugs. But otherwise, the typical absence seizures mostly are very well controlled on valproate therapy. So since this language staring episodes lasting for about 20 minutes and abrupt termination were associated with the typical absence seizures, therefore the drug of choice should be valproate. And I'm sure you would have answered this question because we have discussed this question many times in our exams. Not this particular question, but this typical language of the presentation of absence seizures. We have discussed it many times in our classes. Coming to question number 8. Now, question number 8 says that infant had a history of abdominal distension and chronic constipation. There is no treatment which is given before to this child. There is a history of not having passed meconium for more than 48 hours. Now, this is one of the very, very important leading indications to what the answer can be. A child who has not passed meconium for more than 48 hours after birth. Most newborns, they pass meconium within 24 hours, and most newborns, they pass urine within 48 hours. But 98 to 99% of newborns, they pass meconium by 48 hours. If a child does not pass meconium even by 48 hours, there are many disorders that come to our mind. And one of the first disorders that should come to our mind is the Hirschsprung disease. Apart from Hirschsprung disease, anal stenosis, small intestinal obstructions, large intestinal obstructions, small left colon, then meconium ileus. These are some of the disorders that should come to your mind. But the first disorder that should come to your mind when there is a delayed meconium passage after birth is Hirschsprung disease. And again, in my classes, we have discussed at length about Hirschsprung disease. If you have attended the classes, I'm sure you would have answered this question very easily. Hirschsprung disease is one of the most common congenital disorder involving the motility, abnormalities in the motility of the intestine. So it's the most common congenital disorder of the intestine, which involves abnormal motility of the intestine. The disorder is associated with absence of the ganglions in the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus of the distal intestine. So distal intestine, what happens is there is absence of the ganglion cells. So that part of the intestine which does not have the ganglion cells will get collapsed, will be contracted, while the proximal part of the intestine which will have normal ganglion will be dilated. This can be best seen on doing a barium enema. So a barium enema done in these children can show you that typical picture wherein the part of the distal intestine, the rectosigmoid portion of the colon is most commonly affected. So that part which does not have the ganglion cells is collapsed, and the part which is proximal to this aganglionic portion, which is the normal ganglionic part, is dilated. And often in between the dilated proximal part, which is normally ganglionic, and the distal part which is collapsed, which is aganglionic, in between these two parts we often have a transitional zone, which is a zone of hypoganglionic intestinal portion. So this typical picture can be seen on barium enema. Also in these cases, the screening can be done by anorectal manometry, but the best investigation for confirming diagnosis is always the rectal biopsy. So rectal suction biopsy is the best way to identify a Hirschsprung disease. So you do a rectal suction biopsy and you see the biopsied specimen under the microscope, and if you can identify the absence of the ganglion cells along with hypertrophic nerve fibers and increase acetylcholinesterase activity, then Hirschsprung disease is diagnosed. The treatment of Hirschsprung disease is surgical, but it's a straightforward, I think, question and a straightforward answer. So actually speaking, according to me, most of the questions from pediatrics were doable. If you have attended the classes properly, you have made your notes properly, you have read pediatrics properly, most of these questions were very easily doable. Majority of them had been discussed in our classes. Coming to question number 9. Now, question number 9 again is a very easy disorder to identify. Any disorder which presents with gum bleeding, in which vitamin deficiency can be associated with gum bleeding, obviously it is scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. So a very, very simple question to answer. Now, scurvy occurs because of vitamin C deficiency. The enzyme for vitamin C synthesis, gulnolactone oxidase, is not available in humans. So although this is present in fruits and vegetables, but if a child or the family is not been taking proper fruits or has not been taking vegetables, and they are primarily say non-vegetarians, in those cases vitamin C deficiency followed by scurvy can develop. Now, vitamin C has a very good role in the synthesis of collagen. So in the absence of collagen, there can be a number of problems that can develop. So initial symptoms in scurvy may often be very non-specific. So the child may have anorexia or the child may have irritability, but gradually the typical bleeding episodes will start appearing. So there may be petechial spots that may be present, there may be bleeding from the gums that may be present. Bleeding episodes can also occur in the joints, often leading to hemarthrosis. There can be subcortical hemorrhages of the bones also, which often can lead to joint pains. So these young children with vitamin C deficiency often have difficulty or often have fear of moving their legs, because when they move the legs, it becomes very painful. So they keep the legs in a neutral position, something referred to as pseudo paralysis. The typical X-ray sign of scurvy, I'm sure you all know, seen on the bones. So you have typical ground glass opacity of the bones. Ground glass opacity of the bones. Obviously, because the osteoid framework is not properly laid down in the absence of collagen. The cortex is usually very thin. So it's a pencil thin cortex. Pencil thin cortex. Because the ossification at the metaphysis is occurring normally, a white line of Frankel is formed at the metaphysis. A white line of Frankel is formed at the metaphysis, and below that white line of Frankel is a radiolucent zone which is known as the trauma-filled zone. So trauma-filled zone is a radiolucent zone which is seen below that white line of Frankel. It's the radiolucent zone which is seen below that white line of Frankel. This trauma-filled zone may often extend on both sides to form Pelton spurs. It can lead to Pelton spurs. Then these ground glass opacities seen in the epiphysis along with normal ossification rings around them often will be referred to as the Wimberger's rings. Please do not confuse a Wimberger ring with the Wimberger sign. The Wimberger sign is usually seen in congenital syphilis, which is the destruction of the proximal tibial metaphysis, but Wimberger's ring is often seen in scurvy. The treatment of scurvy will be vitamin C, oral vitamin C. So this is question number 9. Again, a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. Gum bleeding seen in vitamin C deficiency in children. This disorder has become quite rare now, but nevertheless, it does not mean that this disorder is still not seen. It is still seen and very easily to identify. In majority of cases, the best way of identifying the disorder is based upon the symptoms, the typical presentation. Now coming to question number 10. Now question number 10 is a question on endocrinology which says a child of short stature is being evaluated. Growth hormone levels are shown to be high, but the IGF-1 levels are shown to be low. So the growth hormone levels are shown to be high, but the IGF-1 levels are shown to be low. Now growth hormone which is secreted from the anterior pituitary is usually controlled by two main hormones. One is the growth hormone releasing hormone and one is the growth hormone inhibition hormone which is known as somatostatin. So somatostatin is the growth hormone inhibitory hormone while the growth hormone releasing hormone. So both of these control the pulsatile secretions of the growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Now growth hormone has various actions in the body, but the growth hormone does not produce these actions directly. How does the growth hormone produce these actions? It stimulates the release of insulin growth factor. So first it acts on a receptor, which is the growth hormone receptor. And after acting on the growth hormone receptor, it stimulates the liver and some other cells to secrete IGF-1. Insulin like growth factor 1, insulin growth factor 1. So this insulin growth factor 1 or insulin like growth factor 1 is a peptide which is secreted mainly by the liver, but also through the paracrine effects, growth hormone stimulates other cells to release insulin growth factor 1, which then will also stimulate the release of insulin growth factor binding protein 3. So ultimately both insulin growth factor 1 and insulin growth factor binding protein 3 are being released and are mediating the effects of growth hormone only when the growth hormone produces its effects on the receptor. Now when there is a receptor defect, say a receptor defect because of mutation, in those cases the level of growth hormone despite becoming very high, so the levels of growth hormone despite becoming very high, the levels of insulin growth factor 1 and even the levels of insulin growth factor BP3 binding protein 3 will be low, leading to growth hormone deficiency features such as short stature. So our case is very much similar to this case. The child is a case of short stature, and this short stature possibly is because of growth hormone deficiency. So when we do a growth hormone stimulation test, a provocative growth hormone test, we should identify low basal growth hormone levels. But in case the basal growth hormone levels are high, as we are seeing in this case, then we do expect that the levels of growth hormone, if they are high, then the levels of insulin growth factor 1 should also be high, because ultimately it's the growth hormone which is stimulating the release of insulin growth factor 1. But in this case, it is not like this. Growth hormone levels have become very high, but the IGF-1 levels are becoming low, which indicates there is a receptor defect, something which has been referred in the past as Laron's dwarfism and now is better known as the Laron's syndrome. So this fact is known as the Laron's syndrome. And our case appears to be similar to this case. There is an apparent growth hormone receptor defect, as a result of which the child is manifesting with growth hormone deficiency. So he is having a short stature. And although his levels of growth hormone are high, but his insulin growth factor 1 levels are low. Possibly when the insulin growth factor binding protein 3 levels will be done, they will also be found to be low, meaning that there is an apparent receptor defect which is present in this case. And this in the past was called as Laron's dwarfism, and now it is called as Laron's syndrome. That is why when you suspect growth hormone deficiency to be a cause of short stature, just doing a growth hormone stimulation test and measuring the basal growth hormone levels is not enough, because there might be cases in which the growth hormone levels are high, still the child is manifesting growth hormone deficiency because the child is suffering from a receptor defect. That is why when you're doing a growth hormone assessment, not only are the levels of growth hormone basal levels required to be measured, but should also measure the levels of insulin growth factor 1 and insulin growth factor binding protein 3. Coming to question number 11. Again, a very simple, straightforward question. Fat sugar baby appearance is a feature of kwashiorkor in children. Kwashiorkor is a typical type of protein energy malnutrition, not very common in India, which is seen in children somewhere between 1 year to 4 years of age, and it is associated with a combination of mental changes, growth retardation, plus edema. So this is the classical triad that is seen in children with kwashiorkor. There is mental changes, including an apathetic look, irritability often present in these children, along with growth retardation and the presence of edema. This swelling or puffiness, especially present over the face, often gives rise to a typical fat sugar baby appearance in these children. Marasmus in comparison has been associated always with a wasted appearance. Growth retardation is present in marasmus also, but there it is a wasted appearance. Mental changes are usually not seen in marasmus. In marasmus, normally the children have a very alert appearance. But an apathetic look or an irritable look are more commonly features of kwashiorkor. More so, kwashiorkor often is associated with a very poor appetite in comparison to marasmus, which is associated with a voracious appetite. So I think question number 11, fat sugar baby appearance, is a feature of, this is a very straightforward question with a straightforward answer. Answer is kwashiorkor in children. Children with marasmus often have an appearance which is known as the monkey facies. Then question number 12, a child with excessive cry and cyanosis improves after crying. This again is a very much similar history of a choanal atresia, typical history of a choanal atresia, especially when the choanal atresia is a bilateral choanal atresia in young children, particularly newborns. So in choanal atresia, what happens is the posterior part of the choanae are usually blocked. The posterior choanae are the posterior part of the nasopharynx, so they are blocked. So when the child is delivered, the child is not able to breathe in case there is a bilateral choanal atresia. In case there is a unilateral choanal atresia, most children may remain asymptomatic. But in case there is a bilateral choanal atresia, that means both sides of the nasopharynx are blocked. The child will not be able to breathe after birth. Now they cannot breathe through the mouth because most of the newborns and infants are obligate nasal breathers. So the only way of breathing is through the mouth or through the nose. So because their noses are blocked, because of the choanae being blocked either by a membrane or by a bony flap, so these children start crying. And when they start crying, they open up the mouth. And when they open up the mouth during crying, they take large amounts of air through the mouth, leading to improvement in cyanosis after crying. So that's the reason why most of these children with bilateral choanal atresia, the cyanosis improves after crying. So since the improvement of cyanosis is during the time when the child opens up the mouth during crying, the primary principle of management of these children before the surgery is performed is to insert an oral airway. So an oral airway should be inserted immediately, and that's the primary way of managing these children till the time the final corrective surgery is performed. The airway that we have used in these children classically is the McGovern's nipple, which is used for securing the oral airways. You can see the McGovern's nipple, which is often used for securing the oral airways. But otherwise, oral airway insertion is one of the best ways to improve the overall prognosis in these children before the surgery is performed. In case, yes, where this is not possible, in those cases, tracheostomies need to be performed, and ultimately then the child needs to be taken up for surgery. So this typical history of the child improving or the cyanosis in the child improving after crying, this typically goes in favor of a choanal atresia, particularly a bilateral choanal atresia, and the treatment of choice of a bilateral choanal atresia is immediate oropharyngeal airway insertion or oral airway insertion. so that the child can keep on breathing through the mouth till the time the final surgery is performed. Coming to question number 13. Now, question number 13 again is a very fairly simple question because the picture very clearly tells you the answer. In a child with fever and rash, and I'm just giving you a representation image, a representative image. Basically, I'm not sure if this image was there or not, but the typical image that students tell are the image of a slap cheek appearance. So there were rashes that were present on both sides of the cheek, and this type of typical slap cheek appearance is a feature of erythema infectiosum, which is also known as the fifth disease. Erythema infectiosum of fifth disease is caused by a DNA virus. It is caused by parvovirus B19. Parvovirus B19 is the only virus among the Parvoviridae family which is pathogenic to humans. The most common manifestation of parvovirus B19 in children is this infection known as erythema infectiosum. The disease or infection usually occurs in children between 5 to 15 years of age. So children between 5 to 15 years of age are classically affected. After an incubation period of approximately 4 to 28 days, the children develop some non-specific prodromal symptoms, including fever and headache, prodromal symptoms, and this is then followed by the development of rashes. The rashes are very characteristic in cases of erythema infectiosum. So initially the rash that appears in erythema infectiosum is a rash which is seen on both sides of the face, as you can see in the picture, as if the child has been slapped on both sides. This is referred to as the slap cheek appearance. Then gradually the rashes from the face will gradually disappear, and then these rashes start appearing on the extensors on both sides, followed by the disappearance of rashes in the center of these extensors, leading to a lacy reticulate rashes. Often these lacy reticulate pattern of rashes present over the extensors is one of the classical presentation of the rash in erythema infectiosum. Although in erythema infectiosum rash can be because the slap cheek appearance rash is also present, but we will not say slap cheek appearance rash is the classical rash of erythema infectiosum, because such type of malar rashes can be present in many other infections or many other disorders such as SLE also. So initially the rashes are usually over the face, then they spread over the extensors of the trunk, and then there is clearing in the center, often leading to a lacy reticulate pattern of rash. And this lacy reticulate pattern of rash is the classical rash that is seen in erythema infectiosum. Usually treatment is only supportive treatment required, and this is a self-limiting illness. So this is a very clear answer. If a child presents to you with this type of a picture, and especially if erythema infectiosum is one of the choices given, then the answer should be the fifth disease or erythema infectiosum. Coming to question number 14. Now, question number 14 says a child of 3 years of age with fever and cough who is unable to take feeds. So the child is unable to take feeds for the last 2 days. The respiratory rate of the child is 42 per minute, with chest indrawing also present in this child. So according to the IMNCI classification, the integrated management of childhood, neonatal and childhood illnesses, a child presenting to you with cough and cold should be divided into no pneumonia. That means the child only has cough and cold, or the child may be categorized into pneumonia, or the child may be categorized into a severe pneumonia, or a very severe disease. However, there is no term known as very severe pneumonia. Now, a child with cough and cold is a child who has cough present, but there is no respiratory distress or no tachypnea present in this child. Now, in our patient, there is presence of chest indrawing also, and there is presence of fast breathing also. What is the respiratory rate in our patient? It is 42 per minute. Now, fast breathing or tachypnea is defined as a respiratory rate more than 60 per minute in a child who is less than 2 months, a respiratory rate more than 50 per minute in a child who is between 2 to 12 months, a respiratory rate of more than 40 per minute in a child who is between 1 to 5 years of age. So as you can see, our patient is 3 years of age, and at 3 years of age, a respiratory rate of more than 40 per minute should be taken as tachypnea. And in our case, the respiratory rate is more than 40, it's 42 per minute. So our patient has fast breathing also, and our patient has chest indrawing also. So when both fast breathing and chest indrawing are present without any danger signs, then this is a case of pneumonia. So when there is presence of tachypnea and chest indrawing without any features suggestive of danger signs, so tachypnea and chest indrawing, if they are present, we call it as a case of pneumonia. So our patient appears to have a pneumonia. In case there are presence of danger signs, or in case there is presence of a stridor in an otherwise calm child, then we call it as a case of a severe pneumonia or a very severe disease. Danger signs include persistent vomitings, or danger signs include a child who is unable to drink. So our patient was unable to drink, or a child who is unconscious, or a child who has seizures or who has history of seizures. So in our patient, there was a danger sign present. And what was the danger sign? The danger sign was the child was unable to take feeds. For 2 days. So our patient has chest indrawing also, cough also, and the child is unable to take feeds also for 2 days. That is why I would better say that this is a case of a severe pneumonia. If the child would have been having chest indrawing and the child would have been having fast breathing, but there would not have been any danger sign, then I would have said this is a case of pneumonia. But in our patient, there is a danger sign present, unable to take feeds for 2 days. So this becomes a case of a severe pneumonia. No pneumonias require no antibiotics. Only manage cough by home remedies. Follow up after 5 days. Pneumonias require oral amox for 5 days. Cough management, again by simple home remedies, and follow up after 2 days. Severe pneumonias or very severe disease, 1 shot of IVMP plus 1 shot of Genta, and the child should be immediately referred to a heart center. Even in cases of pneumonias, if the oxygen saturation of the child is less than 90%, the child should be immediately referred to a heart center. So in our patient, because of the presence of fast breathing, chest indrawing, and danger signs, I would say our patient has a severe pneumonia. Now coming to question number 15. Now question number 15 is a question on thymic hypoplasia, TOF, and hypocalcemia, along with deletion on chromosome 22. So there's the most common disorder of cell-mediated immunity, the most common disorder of immunity in children is a disorder which is called as chromosome 22q 11.2 deletion syndrome, and most of these children have a disorder called as the Dye-George syndrome. So this is the most common disorder of cell-mediated immunity in children. There are disorders of humoral immunity or antibody productions in children also, and there are disorders of cell-mediated immunity in children also. The most common disorder of cell-mediated immunity in children is a disorder called as chromosome 22q 11.2 deletion syndrome. And most of these children have Dye-George syndrome, where there is a deletion of a gene on chromosome 22, leading to manifestations which come under the mnemonic CATCH. So C stands for congenital heart defect, A stands for abnormal face, T stands for thymic hypoplasia, C stands for cleft palate, and H stands for hypocalcemia. So C stands for congenital heart defect, and one of the most common congenital heart defects that are seen with Dye-George syndrome is tetralogy of Fallot. TOF is usually associated with Dye-George syndrome and with Down syndrome. Then A stands for abnormal face, abnormality in the face. T stands for thymic hypoplasia. That is why there is a deficiency of cell-mediated immunity. C stands for cleft palate and H stands for hypocalcemia. And this disorder usually is because of deletion of gene located on chromosome 22. So in our patient, they have asked thymic hypoplasia, they have asked TOF, and they have asked hypocalcemia. And they have also said due to deletion of gene on chromosome 22. So very clearly the answer is a Dye-George syndrome. It's the most common disorder associated with cell-mediated immunity abnormality in children. Coming to the next question, which is question number 16. A neonate with discharge of meconium from the umbilical stump. Which of the following condition should be considered? I remember a few FMGEs back, there was a question, very much similar question, but then they are that there is a clear discharge from the umbilicus, and at that time the answer was that there is probably patency of the allantoic duct. Now you can see there are two ducts that are present in the umbilicus. One is known as the allantoic duct and one is known as the fetal duct. You are seeing the two ducts. I'll show them with an arrow. You can see the two ducts. The allantoic duct usually is a connection. The allantoic duct is usually the connection from the umbilicus up to the allantois, which later on goes on to become the urinary bladder. While the Wittline duct, which is also known as the omphallomesenteric duct, is a connection from the umbilicus to the midgut. Now both these ducts which are present in the umbilical cord of the fetus usually are known to involute immediately after birth. But suppose they remain patent, they are likely to present with symptoms depending upon which duct remains patent. So since the allantoic duct is a connection from the umbilicus to the urinary bladder, allantois goes on to become the urinary bladder. So therefore what will happen is that in case the allantoic duct, so allantoic duct is a connection which connects the umbilicus to the upper part of the urinary bladder, the cloaca. So what will happen is that there will be a watery discharge or a urinary discharge from the umbilicus in case the allantoic duct does not involute after birth. But the Wittline duct or the omphallomesenteric duct, mesenteric duct means it is connecting the gut. So in case that duct does not involute, then there might be presence of fecal material or sometimes even the gut mucosa, which may be seen prolapsing from the umbilicus. So in our case, the child is having a discharge of meconium from the umbilicus, which very clearly means that it is possibly a patent Wittline duct or the omphallomesenteric duct, which has not involuted after birth. So since there is a patent connection which is continuing between the umbilicus and the gut, there are chances that there will be prolapse of either the GI mucosa or there might be fecal material such as the meconium that can be seen passing from the umbilicus. Coming to question number 17. So I have told you tetralogy of Fallot is usually associated with two main syndromes. One is known as the Down syndrome and the other is known as the Dye-George syndrome. And we discussed about the Dye-George syndrome. Now I could not get the other options here. TOF is associated with, but definitely Down syndrome is one of the disorders with which TOF is associated. Tetralogy of Fallot is associated very commonly with Down syndrome. Down syndrome, actually speaking, is associated with a number of congenital heart defects, and some of the common congenital heart defects that can be seen in Down syndrome. One of the most common congenital heart defect in Down syndrome is endocardial cushion defects or sometimes called as the atrioventricular septal defects. The second, atrial septal defects. The third, ventricular septal defects, and tetralogy of Fallot are also seen in Down syndrome. So tetralogy of Fallot very commonly associated with two syndromes. One is the Down syndrome and the other is the syndrome that we talked about 2-3 questions back, which was the Dye-George syndrome. Then coming to question number 18, which of the following is a contraindication for breastfeeding? See, this question has been asked in the past also, and let me tell you, there is a lot of differences in what many books says. Actually, there are many contraindications which are given to breastfeeding, including contraindications like galactosemias, primary lactose intolerance, maple syrup urine disease, phenylketonurias, then mother exposure to some radioactive material, or a mother who is having HIV, or mother who is having untreated tuberculosis. So there are many contraindications, but in India, many of these contraindications are not taken because, say for example, HIV, a mother having HIV. In India, we say despite there being a small risk of HIV virus passing through the mother's milk, largely the problems associated with not giving breast milk to a child can be much more than that very small risk of that virus passing from the mother to the child. Hence, in India, what we recommend is that even if the mother is having HIV, if she is on antiretroviral therapies, then she should breastfeed her child. Similarly, for tuberculosis, if the mother is taking ATTs and the child and she's ready to take all precautions, and the child should be given breastfeeds. You should put the child on INH prophylaxis in case the mother has not taken ATT for more than 2 weeks, or in case the mother has taken ATT for more than 2 weeks but still is sputum positive for tuberculosis, then you can put the child on INH prophylaxis but continue giving breastfeeds to the child. So it's not an absolute contraindication. What I would say is whenever an absolute contraindication is asked for breastfeeding, I think the only true absolute contraindication for breastfeeding is galactosemia. As I told you, other contraindications such as primary lactose intolerance are also there. Then phenylketonurias are also there. Some say that another contraindication is a maple syrup urine disease. Then mother exposure to radioactive material. But those, I would say, again, except for primary lactose intolerance and possibly phenylketonuria also, which also should be taken as contraindications. The other are mostly, I would say, relative contraindications. So what I would suggest is that when such questions are asked in the exams, be very careful about the choices. In case suppose galactosemia, they have not given the choice, but they have given a choice as phenylketonuria. That is actually also a contraindication to breastfeeding. Suppose they have given a choice as maple syrup urine disease or a lactose intolerance, that is also a contraindication to giving breast milk. How can you give breast milk to a child who is having lactose intolerance? So therefore, you have to answer the question based upon what options they have given in the exams. Now here, for example, hepatitis B virus infection, even if the mother is hepatitis B virus positive, it's not a contraindication to breastfeeding. Similarly, cytomegalovirus, it's not a contraindication to breastfeeding. Neither is herpes a contraindication to breastfeeding if the lesions do not involve the breast. And here there is nothing to suggest anything like that. So I would say here the true contraindication to breastfeeding should clearly be galactosemia. Other than galactosemia, in case they ask in the exams, be very careful about these choices. These should also be taken as contraindications to breastfeeding. Galactosemia is one of the best well-known contraindications to breastfeeding in children. Now coming to question number 19. Now question number 19 is a question which was an X-ray question where they said a child comes in with complaints of choking. Mother saw her child putting coin in his mouth. X-ray is taken as shown below. Now you can see the X-ray. Now see, it's very clear that the X-ray clearly shows that the coin appears to be either in esophagus or possibly it may be in the trachea. Now please remember that whenever coins are stuck in the esophagus, they usually get stuck in the coronal plane. And whenever they are stuck in the trachea, they are usually stuck in the sagittal plane. Which clearly means that suppose the coin is in the esophagus, on the anterior-posterior view of the X-ray, as you can see here, the flat surface of the coin, the round surface can be seen, while in the lateral view, you will see the edge of the coin, if the coin is in the esophagus. On the AP view, you will see the flat surface, while in the lateral view, you will see the edge of the coin. But the opposite will be true when the coin will be in the trachea. In the anterior-posterior view, the AP view, you will see the edge of the coin. While in the lateral view, you will see the face of the coin, the flat surface of the coin, because in the trachea, coins are usually stuck in the sagittal plane. While in the esophagus, the coins are usually stuck in the coronal plane. That is why this very clearly shows that the coin right now appears to be in the esophagus, because we are seeing the AP view and we can see the flat surface of the coin in front of us. So the coin clearly is in the coronal plane, it's not in the sagittal plane. So what is the answer to question number 19? The question number 19 answer is that the coin appears to be in the esophagus, not in the trachea. Question number 20, what is the dose of vitamin A given in a child aged 14 months? So whenever there is a documented vitamin A deficiency, as for example, problems associated with the eyes, and there is a documented vitamin deficiency, then vitamin A administration is always based upon the age of the child. Less than 6 months, 6 months to 12 months, and more than 12 months. So less than 6 months, the dose of vitamin A is 50,000 units orally. 6 to 12 months, the dose is 1 lakh unit orally. And more than 12 months, the dose is 2 lakh unit orally. Now this should be given on day 0. it should be given on day 1 and it should be given on day 28. But please get it cross checked from your ophtha faculties, because what happens is that I have been told by some of the students that in ophtha they have told that in cases of vitamin A deficiency, the supplementation should be on 0, 1 and 14 days. In OPGAI, I think they have mentioned it as 0, 1 and 28 days. Hence, I'm telling you 0, 1 and 4 weeks is the supplementation regime for vitamin A deficiency. But it would be better if you take an opinion from the ophtha faculties also. Overall, less than 6 months, the dose of vitamin A is 50,000 units. 6 months to 12 months, the dose of vitamin A is 1 lakh units. And more than 12 months, the dose of vitamin A is 2 lakh units. So in our patient, since the child is 14 months of age, which is more than 1 year of age, I think the best answer here should be 2 lakh units. Now, it also depends upon whether they had mentioned about oral or injectable, but I could not get from the students that they had specially mentioned oral or injectable. Otherwise, in case we are giving oral doses, these are the oral doses. Injectable doses usually are given only when there are corneal of the clouding of the cornea present, or very severe vitamin A deficiency present, where vision is actually getting affected. Otherwise, in most cases of vitamin A deficiency, oral vitamin A supplementation is given using these doses of vitamin A. So less than 6 months, 50,000 units, 6 months to 12 months, 1 lakh units, and more than 12 months, 2 lakh units. In case it is 14-month-old child, that is more than 1-year-old child. Coming to question number 21. A child comes with face swelling. He had cola colored urine. Again, a straightforward question which we have discussed many times in the exams. This is clearly a case of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Now, post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis typically is a type of glomerulonephritis which very commonly causes acute glomerulonephritis in children. It's in fact the most common cause of acute glomerulonephritis in children. It is associated with the development of cola colored urine. When I say cola colored urine, it means very dark urine. That color, cola color or the tea color urine, is because of the hemolysis of the red cells as they pass through the glomerulus. Many of these children also have puffiness over the face, edema, as is present in our patient also. Puffiness of the face, edema is present. Most of the time, this puffiness is very clearly visible in the morning when the child gets up, periorbital puffiness around the eyes. If the child is doing his day-to-day activities and is doing his normal work, in those cases, that puffiness gradually reduces by the end of the day. But otherwise, puffiness is best seen in the morning time. In addition, these children often have hypertension episodes also. Most of these children have a history of sore throat 10 to 12 days back. So in cases of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, hematuria classically occurs about 1 to 3 weeks after a throat infection or after an upper respiratory tract infection. 1 to 3 weeks. In cases of IgA nephropathy, the history is about 1 to 3 days after a throat infection, hematuria occurs. So IgA nephropathy is more commonly known as synpharyngitic hematuria. That means the hematuria is almost along with pharyngitis, synpharyngitic hematuria. While in cases of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, the history is almost around 1 to 3 weeks back. In our patient, for example, the history is 10 to 12 days back. So it cannot be IgA nephropathy. It has to be post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Had the history been about, say, 1 to 3 days back, history of throat infection, and now the child is having hematuria, then the best answer would have been IgA nephropathy. But here the history is that the child had hematuria 1 to 3 weeks after a throat infection. For example, here it is occurring 10 to 12 days after a throat infection. So this goes in favor of a post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Treatment of post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis usually is symptomatic management. So with this, I finish up. I think I've tried to collect as many questions that were possible. It's quite likely that some of these questions have been discussed or overlap with other questions which have been taken up by other faculties also. But nevertheless, only the questions have been repeated. It will always be good for you. If we have any other questions, or if you have any other questions, I am available on DBMCI Facebook page also. I'm available on WhatsApp also, and I'm also available on the DBMCI website page. So in case you have any queries, you can either put on the questions on the DBMCI Facebook page, or you can send the questions to the DBMCI people also. They have the email ID of mine, and they can send them to me. So, in any case, please feel free to ask any type of questions that you want to ask for your exams. You again have your exams next year. So, do not shy away from asking any questions in case you have any questions, any queries. But what I could get from my assessment of the paper was that most of the questions were easily doable questions from pediatrics. Had you attended the classes, or had you done the test and discussion with us, I don't think there would have been any difficulty in answering these questions. I'm also available on Telegram page. So in case you want to send any questions on my Telegram page, please feel free to put the questions or post the questions on the Telegram page also. So thank you very much. I hope the session was useful for you, and you were able to correlate the questions and were able to understand their answers. So thank you very much, and a very goodbye.